Okay, this is review video number 4 on Congress. Why have a legislature? Why have Congress? Well, a number of reasons. One, direct democracy is probably too costly. It would be very expensive and very inefficient if all of us were to research everything we needed to know in order to vote well on an issue directly. And so we delegate that task. We delegate the task of being specialized about politics to other people, agents, you might say. A second reason that we have legislatures is that we want to represent a variety or a broad spectrum of the population. You want to represent some combination of regions, political ideas and ideologies, as well as demographic groups, and make sure that they all have influence on the decision-making process. What this does actually is two things. It improves the information with which legislation is made. With broad representation comes more feedback, more expertise, more information about the consequences or likely consequences of legislation. With representation also comes more legitimacy. To the extent that legislation is the product of bargaining between representatives, you can expect that compliance costs are going to be lower than they otherwise might be. Remember those monitoring and enforcement costs. Well, if people feel like the law is fairly legitimate, they're probably more likely to obey it than if they feel the law is totally unjust. Finally, we have a legislature in part just because we need to check and balance the other branches of government. The legislature wields the power of the purse. That is to say, the legislature controls the purse strings for the executive branch, so they can threaten to withdraw funding, for example. They also confirm the judges and ambassadors that the president nominates, or at least the Senate does. And finally, the legislature, through its committee system, conducts hearings on official conduct within the bureaucracy, right? So it can call members of agencies and members of cabinet departments to account for their behavior and make them defend themselves in front of Congress. Okay, why two chambers of Congress? Why bicameralism? Well, originally the framers probably wanted to make sure that the states were represented and the geographic interests were represented. After all, the United States is a union of states. Bicameralism also introduces another level of checks and balances. The Senate and the Congress can check and balance one another. And finally, it's a way of maintaining representativeness while increasing stability and expertise. Having two chambers of Congress enables, on the one hand, the lower chamber, the House. The House is elected every 2 years, and so is fairly in tune with the popular will. They're constantly submitted to re-election, and they have to listen very carefully to what people want, or they're not going to get re-elected. On the other hand, senators are elected to 6-year terms. They can think a little bit more long-term. If a senator's been there gets reelected once, that means that they're going to be serving 12 years in office. That increases sort of the level of stability, and in those 12 years, the legislator can acquire expertise over particular subject matters and issues. So in other words, you could see bicameralism as a kind of compromise between representativeness on the one hand and the need to have experts and some degree of stability in policymaking processes on the other hand. All right. It's worth noting that Congress itself, both within the House and the Senate, is a collective action problem between 435 House members and then between 100 senators. And all these representatives have conflicting individual interests. You might say that good legislation or good non-legislation is a public good. Individual legislators, for instance, may not have the time or energy to become informed about the costs and benefits of each bill. Especially if those bills do not affect their districts very much. If their constituents don't care, they probably don't care. And yet their vote counts just as much as someone who's well informed. And so, again, the private costs of getting that information is a lot higher than the social cost of getting that information. Okay, it's also true that a bill can be opposed by a majority of districts, but approved by a majority of the population. The existence of districts and district voting creates a wedge between the private interests of congressmen. Their private interest is to get reelected by their district, and the interest of the public at large, or the country at large, which is in legislation that benefits all districts. So again, you can kind of see a collective action problem there. How does Congress try to solve this collective action problem? Well, this is why we have committees, caucuses, parties, and congressional staffs. All of these institutions serve to improve the information available to congressmen and congresswomen. If a committee issues a report and studies something, other congressmen can feel more secure that they're voting with good information. Another solution is that we've talked about is the process of log rolling, earmarks, and pork barrel politics. All of these are essentially perks that congressional leadership or congressmen can reward other congressmen with for supporting the national interest, right? So they can agree to vote on one of the bills. They can agree to make certain votes less painful by including a whole bunch of special perks for the individual districts and individual congressmen. What that does is that smooths the path of legislation, and it lessens that conflict between individual interest and collective interest. Now, it's worth noting that Congress doesn't just have a collective action problem, it's got a coordination problem. Even if there's a consensus that something has to be done, for example, contain the rising costs of healthcare, it may be hard to agree on what to do about that problem. Coalition rating is also going to be possible if there's multiple solutions to a problem, at least 3 problems, right? It's at least theoretically possible for entrepreneurs to propose a solution that gains a majority, but then you might gain no stable majority. So what happens then is that committees, parties, caucuses, majority leaders, who are the agenda setters, are going to help resolve these coordination problems by pledging certain groups of votes and increasing the costs of defection to another coalition. Okay. The relationship between a congressman and his or her constituents is also really characteristic of a principal agent problem. The congressman, for example, may have information that the average citizen does not have, or that very few citizens have. This is the asymmetric information problem. And the congressman person may be able to use that information to manipulate the public for personal gain. The congressman will say, only I can fight for you, only I can bring home this bacon for you. And the public may or may not know any better. What the public can do about this is fight back by demanding strong anti-corruption legislation, by demanding term limits, by demanding campaign finance legislation, and by overreacting to seemingly minor wrongdoings like affairs and other things, right? The idea is where there's smoke, there's fire, and so it might actually be rational to completely overreact to minor problems on the assumption that if you see something minor going on, maybe there's something major hiding that you can't see. It's also worth noting, we haven't talked about it much in this class, but the media also will play a role in fighting back against this principal agent problem by revealing information about congressional activities, in as much as people are paying attention. Finally, political parties can impose some discipline on their members. If their members are misbehaving and making the party look bad, they can certainly strip them of their membership at worst, or strip them of important committee positions, or threaten them in other ways. Access to money is important.